Hello, hello. Welcome to Courage Becomes Her, where we connect and share real life stories. I'll talk with women whom I love and I'm inspired by, women who are experiencing life just like you and me. I'm excited for us to gather together and cultivate confidence, courage, and joy in life and work.
Generally speaking, I would say that if a fella is struggling with, trying to say, well, what do I bring to the table? Am I a breadwinner? Do I have a full head of hair? Do I look good? Sound good? Whatever. Am I well educated? They're trying to build up their resume in their own head to give themselves validation. That eventually is going to fail. That insecurity can be like heavy-handed, and it can also be not as severe. Men who are raised by, relatively healthy mother and father tend to fare a little bit easier, and men who have kind of been put through the grinder tend to fare worse. But the root cause is still the same problem. I mean, you either find your identity in Christ or you look for it elsewhere, and wherever you look for it elsewhere may or may not work for a season, may or may not be destructive.
Well, hello, friends. Nope, you're not in the wrong place. This is Courage Becomes Her. But yes, I do have a man as our guest today, specifically my man, my husband of almost 22 years, Corey. So let me tell you just a little bit about Corey, and then I'll tell you why I have him on the show today, joining us today. So Corey was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. But ever since I've known him, and even before that, he has been a lover of philosophy, specifically focused on theology and art and beauty, which he talks a little bit about in today's conversation. But he has been a published author, is a published author, and is currently working on his second literary fiction novel. The first novel is linked in the show notes for you in case you're interested, but I will give a warning that it is most definitely not for the faint of heart. So Corey is happiest when we're just relaxing together and spending time with our cats, but he does love the occasional good game of sardines with our nieces and nephews. So today's conversation, which you'll hear more about as Corey and I get into it, but it's focused on insecurity. And I want to tell you just a little bit about Corey's background to help you to understand that there are some differences and some nuances in him and his life that may not be present for other people. And you'll hear us talk about that throughout the conversation, that there are, obviously in all of us, varying degrees of health and unhealthiness based on our upbringings. So a little bit more about Corey. So Corey and his twin brother were raised by their grandmother until they were about 10 years old. And when their grandmother was no longer able to take care of them, they were put into an orphanage. Yes, California had, at least in the 80s, orphanages still. And Corey's been in 2 different orphanages, multiple group homes and foster homes. And when they were about 15 years old, he and his brother ran away and tried to find their father, who was living in a station wagon in the Bay Area. And they actually lived, the 3 of them, in the station wagon for 3 years, from when the boys were about 15 to 18 years old. Mental illness runs in Corey's family, specifically with his father having been diagnosed with schizophrenia in the late 70s. And in adulthood, both Corey and his brother were diagnosed with bipolar I disorder, as well as for Corey, anxiety disorder and PTSD. So all of this background definitely had a hand in Corey having extreme insecurity. And so through this conversation today, we talk about what does it look like for wives to handle and face life with husbands who have insecurity. Now, again, I know that Corey's background is more extreme than most, but I certainly do know from 11 years of coaching women that insecurity most certainly happens in all husbands, regardless of extreme backgrounds like Corey's. So I'm just so grateful for Corey and his willingness to share with us today. And I know that you will be encouraged to just think about insecurity in your marriage and your relationships in a new and a different way based on what he's sharing with us today. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, babe, for joining me today for this conversation.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, you know the drill a little bit, that for Courage Becomes Her, we get to know our guests before we launch into our topic. So all of them, obviously, I already know. But the first one is, where is home?
Ooh, that's rough. Not here. I'm not sure where, but I'm thinking Mars? I don't know.
So we're in kind of a transitional stage of life.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Currently living in California.
Yeah, on the coast.
Yes. Yeah. So where we're calling home for the moment. All right. What was the first concert that you ever went to?
I've never been to a concert. Although when I was in the children's shelter in San Jose, when I was like, 12 or 13, I was sitting out on the back steps one night. I'd snuck out. And in the San Jose amphitheater or somewhere, David Bowie was playing, and I could hear his actual voice echoing down to where I was sitting. So that's my first concert.
There we go. Yeah. All right. Unintentional David Bowie concert. Yeah. Wow. All right. Okay. I know that you do love movies and occasionally shows, but you're more of a movie guy. So what would you say is the best movie or show that you've watched in the last year-ish?
I would say, generally speaking, I love the Coen brothers. Possibly Raising Arizona or Wes Anderson. Yeah, Wes Anderson. So any of those two.
Okay.
Yeah, their films are
any of their
good.
films are good. Yeah. I would agree with that. All right. What has made you laugh or filled your cup in the last day or so?
Well, I do like gardening. That fills my cup in a different way. I mean, actual laughter, probably Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I don't know why that guy makes me laugh so much.
That show is pretty funny.
Yeah. Some general joy just from scripture and spending time with God. I mean, honestly, without, like that scripture, everything else just kind of falls flat. So I suppose, I guess, in short, a combination between talking to God and gardening and comedic shows. I definitely have got to stay away from true crime, though. So,
yeah, that has created the opposite of laughter.
Yeah, super paranoid.
Yes, yeah, so true. All right, good. Yeah, those are really good ones. And I do love that you're enjoying gardening. Okay, so I always ask the guests what their Enneagram is and their love language. I know what both of yours are, but do you know what both of yours are?
No. You've told it to me like 10 times.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I don't get it. So go ahead.
Yeah, so definitely your love language is words of affirmation, which I think that will actually come out a little bit in our conversation today for sure.
I will, yep.
Yeah. And then your Enneagram is definitely a 4. Like you are the romantic that is very feelings oriented is how they kind of categorize it. So yeah, you're definitely the 4 for sure. Okay, how about a current obsession? So the guests get to talk about whatever their current obsession is in any genre. It can be an app, a podcast, a show, a product, anything.
Well, I don't want to nerd out on it, but for sure, the relationship between theology and the arts,
Yeah.
specifically, does God speak to people through beauty, such as, poetry, music, but for me, principally paintings. And when and if he does actually speak through beauty, is he saying something true about himself rather than like trying to give you an emotional boost? Like he's actually, it's weird because you don't normally think of beauty as expressing true truth. Do you know what I mean? It's more like everyone thinks of art as subjective, and there is a subjective element to it. But the question is there actually something being said by the Lord in it that is as just as reliable as, say, a verse?
That's good. Yeah, you've opened my eyes to that a lot. And I think it's worth noting, too, that both of your novels, the covers of each of them are paintings, pieces of art that totally spoke to you.
Yeah. The first one is from the Sistine Chapel, and the second one was his name Mike Carson?
Yeah.
Mike Carson, yeah. Yeah, I like that guy's paintings.
Good. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, our last get to know you question is, what book has transformed your life?
Most definitely Less Than Zero by Brett Ellis. Also Rumblefish by S.E. Hinton. Those two books are definitely impactful for me in my life.
Yeah, you've talked about both of those books since basically the day that we met 23-ish years ago. So that makes sense for sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for letting us get to know you a little bit. So we're in this series on marriage, the blessings and the burdens of marriage. And you and I have been, over the last 2 years, going through what I would categorize as the most difficult time of our marriage ever up to this point. And through a whole series of events and conversations, I asked you if you'd be willing to talk about it, because certainly what we have been going through and experiencing is not just us. Like, this is definitely a conversation, a topic that is bigger than just us. So I specifically asked you to join me to talk about insecurity in marriage and what that looks like. And I want to say before we dive into it that we are most definitely still in the messy middle of this, that a lot of things have been illumined for us and we have grown in a number of aspects of it, but we're very much still in it and haven't, quote unquote, solved it or licked it, or, it's not behind us, if you will. So there's rawness, for us in that. And I also want to say thank you to you, babe, for being willing to have the conversation, because I know it exposes both of us, but it exposes you really specifically. And so I'm grateful for your courage to be vulnerable, and specifically to encourage and give hope to the women who are joining us. The Courage Becomes Her women who are joining us. I do want to just make one quick point to say that Corey can have spicy language. So please don't be offended through the course of this conversation. But definitely listen to the heart of our conversation rather than, maybe the spicy language that comes out. So I think maybe a way to tee up the conversation to start with is that I think we both believe that, like, insecurity happens, period, and will always happen. And you're going to talk a little bit about, or I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about, like, what's behind that. But I also do want to say that I think it goes without saying that the socio-political environment that our country has been in, particularly since 2016, has really like increased fear, insecurity, anger, those sorts of things, especially in men, and that is impacting marriage in a pretty significant way, and that is a little bit of our story, but not entirely our story. So I do want to say, just kind of from a big picture standpoint, that's a little bit of where this conversation is coming from. So maybe just start us off by kind of giving a definition or a picture of like, what does insecurity in marriage look like? Like if a woman who's listening maybe isn't quite sure if what they're maybe seeing in their husband is insecurity or not, like how can they tell, like from those behaviors, that those behaviors are a sign of insecurity, particularly in marriage or in their relationship?
Well, at root, insecurity is essentially fear. And the problem with fear is that you can only live under it for so long before, one, you either break down, two, you start medicating heavily in whatever way you enjoy, or three, you just start getting a very short fuse. It might start off as like bickering, kind of petty dart throwing, just a real edge. Essentially, I know that men who live under fear eventually start getting angrier, which can lead to violence. It can lead to drugs and alcohol. It can lead to adultery. It can lead to porn addiction. It can lead to buying a sports car. Essentially, though, it's fear of a lack of an inherent self-worth, an inherent value. Does that help at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a tie to, or a strong connection with, identity, period, of how a man sees himself.
Yeah, and your point about the current cultural climate, unfortunately, has really poured fuel on the fire. Men are being attacked for, well, a few things. Some of it is not without merit, though.
Sure.
And generally speaking, I would say that if a fella is struggling with, trying to say, well, what do I bring to the table? Which, by the way, on a side note, is, at least theologically speaking, is an unhealthy position because it's self-focused. That's not to say that, you can just snap out of that kind of thinking. I mean, it seems to be a hard habit to kick.
Yeah.
But, if somebody's saying to himself, what do I bring to the table? Am I a breadwinner? Do I have a full head of hair? Do I look good? Sound good? Whatever. Am I well educated? They're trying to build up their resume in their own head to give themselves validation. That eventually is going to fail. It is interesting then to say, though, that depending on how they're raised and what their personality makeup is, that insecurity can be like heavy-handed, and it can also be not as severe. Men who are raised by, relatively healthy mother and father tend to fare a little bit easier, and men who have kind of been put through the grinder tend to fare worse. So if you take the two men and you put them side by side, the insecurity might not be as strong in the healthy guy as it is in the unhealthy guy. But the root cause is still the same problem. I mean, you either find your identity in Christ or you look for it elsewhere, and wherever you look for it elsewhere may or may not work for a season, may or may not be destructive, which, can sometimes be fun. But
okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense. What I think one of the things, obviously, that we've talked a lot about is, and you just alluded to it, but I want to draw it out a little bit more, is where they're looking for their identity. And I think there are common places that we all, but men in particular, are looking right now, more specifically, that you and I have talked about. Of clearly there some that you alluded to again, but like money, the power, the career, those sorts of things. But another big one that I think a lot of women don't understand is looking to women for that identity, for that affirmation. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a big problem because essentially men in their fallen state, if we can say it that way, find their ultimate sense of self-worth in a woman because it's the most potent relationship there is for a man anyway. I would only qualify that by saying that I don't know what life looks like for a father. So I don't know if their kids become their everything or not. But in my experience and the men that I've dealt with who have had kids, it's still women.
Yeah.
And the math on it is pretty straightforward. I guess I would say it like, if validation from a woman is the highest form of validation a man can get, generally speaking, not always, in this life, and of the kinds of validation a woman can give to a man, the highest level of that validation, at least in a man's mind, is if she has sex with him. Because most men know, and these are American men, by the way, I don't know about anyone else, that healthy women, generally speaking, don't give up the goods easy.
Yeah.
And so when a woman does give it up, for a man, that's like the ultimate affirmation. Basically, it's of the kinds of spiritual experiences you can have in this life. And by spiritual experience, I only mean like doing something that impacts your soul or has an impact on it. It's just anything can do it. But there are, generally speaking, levels of it. Spending time with God is obviously a high one. But in a man's mind, talking to a God who's invisible, or a woman who, come on, let's,
right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So for a male, then essentially what happens is he replaces God and God's approval with the validation from a woman, and a woman's, according to his mind, the most she can give a guy is sex. Because that's like for a man, he knows that means something. It's not just, I know there's, all kinds, but generally speaking, when a woman's sexually intimate, it's a big deal for her.
Right.
But then, of course, the men get addicted to it. And then eventually, if the relationship begins to deteriorate or sour, or maybe he's not improving, in his emotions and his psychology very well, she may show dissatisfaction, a less interest in sex, which is going to translate to his mind as rejection, which means he's going to have to get that validation some other way. And we all know the chaos that comes as a result of that.
Yeah, definitely. That can come as a result of that. I think it's, and we've talked about this many times in our conversations, and I want to just call it out. Like, I think it's important for the women of Courage Becomes Her that are listening to hear that does not then mean that it's their fault. They shouldn't personalize it, and they shouldn't automatically think, oh, if I start having sex more regularly with my husband, that's going to fix it or cure it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. First off, it's not even a woman's responsibility to save her husband. That's not her job, and she's not designed for it. And vice versa, by the way. It's not. A husband can come to his wife and be like, look, man, we should spice this up and do this or that, just like he's gone off the reservation, and she could do it. And it might last for a season, but he'll come back with more and more and more, and it just will not satisfy, because the metaphor I like to use is that form of validation is like a forest fire, and it just keeps burning and burning until you take the fuel away. There's just, it is unsatisfied. It just doesn't get enough. So absolutely. Yeah. A woman's not going to save her husband by banging him. I don't know. I guess that's just an individual relationship about like where and when to be intimate, to talk about it or whatever. So I don't think there's a one size fits all solution, but I can tell you, if she tries to go, meet him in whatever the hell is flitting through his mind in the bedroom. It's not going to fix the problem.
Yeah.
May even aggravate it, actually.
Yeah, that's a really good point for sure. Okay, I want to come back to that in a minute of like the role that women do play, that wives can play. But I want to first go back to, so I think we didn't quite unpack it enough, of like, you talked about some of the things that can trigger the insecurity, obviously the root behind it. But I think it's also important because you talked about like healthy upbringing versus not healthy upbringing. So to really call out, like, there are specific things that either trigger or exacerbate it, like trauma, like mental illness, like addiction. You said medicating. So any other thoughts just along kind of that aspect of it?
Yeah, there is one caveat to all this I would just like to put out there, because I know men. I don't know women. So I don't know if they're aware of the fact or not that there's a perception in our culture that men have to be the pursuers, the dominant ones, they do all of it. And women are the pursued and et cetera. But it is important to note that men like to be wanted too. From time to time, they like to be pursued too. So
yeah,
I think I would just throw that out there real quick.
No, that's good. So I think, if we, again, are kind of moving into that camp of how can women be supportive, knowing that, there's an initiative taken from the woman's part in showing desire, in wooing, in inviting that and encouraging through words of affirmation or communication that, no, I actually do desire you.
Right. And again, that's an individual relationship thing, how that would actually play out. And
yeah.
So there's no one size fits all. It's just unfortunate. But
yeah.
So as far as like how trauma plays into insecurity, the running joke is a girl raised without a dad with daddy issues grows up to be a stripper. Although it's strange, the same thing happens for men who don't have a healthy mom in their lives. They begin to crave female approval, which can take on different looks. Yeah. Generally speaking, guys are guys. So it usually takes on chasing the women eventually down the road. Yeah. So, but trauma does play a factor into a man's insecurity, essentially. This isn't like hard math. It's pretty basic. If you grow up feeling like you're not loved, respected, cared for, if it's not, you don't feel like it's okay for you to be expressive of your emotions, or you got a dad who's kind of like stand up and be a man to a freaking 10-year-old, it's not going to do well for the guy later on. So, I don't really think it's anything new or insightful to say that if it's a boy growing up isn't given, the same sense of security, that essentially is going to look for it for himself. And, of course, for men, generally speaking, that tends to be in the direction of women. Yeah. Some chase money, but if you talk to them and listen to them, they want money so they can get women. They want power so they can get women. Yeah. So they want the job and the house and the car so they can get women. Not always. Some guys actually just like chasing a dollar. Sure. Which is bewildering to me. But generally speaking, they're doing all these things because they're hoping to get a damn woman. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I think at some point, some of them, I don't think they have a very clear idea on the fact that they're really chasing after God. They do recognize that they have turned women into an idol. And I think on some level it eats away at them. Yeah. And so they kind of get pissy, abusive, all because the system they set up for themselves is failing. And it's failing, one, because it wasn't meant to save them.
Yeah.
Two, because they're asking women to be something they weren't created to be. And they're resentful when it doesn't work. The only, if I can just, one little side note about that is that in our culture, women can sometimes sell themselves as being a kind of savior in a way, which is a little unfair because men definitely want to hear it.
Yeah.
And definitely want to believe it. But you'd actually have to talk to women about like how prevalent that is and how, how actually ingrained it is. I don't know. I'm just saying that men who set up women as an idol eventually realize the idol isn't working. And usually they don't react well.
Yeah. When that starts to break down, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like all of a sudden they become graceful and humble. So yeah, they usually throw a tantrum.
Yes.
And sometimes that tantrum is a doozy. So
yeah, totally makes sense for sure. Okay. So something that we've made as an assumption a little bit in this conversation up to this point is that husbands are actually talking about this with their wives. So I count myself incredibly blessed and
I see how you're
probably
saying that.
Rare that you actually talk to me about it, that you've been open with me to say, this is what is happening for me. This is why it's happening. Although it did take us a little bit of time, I would say a solid 9 months to really unpack and truly figure out the why. But my belief is, especially based on kind of the cultural climate that we see right now, that most men are not actually openly communicating with their wives about this. So let's operate under the assumption that that is the case, that most aren't communicating. So is there something that a wife can do, a woman can do, to either encourage that communication, invite that communication, or should she just leave it alone? Like, what overall my question would be, like, what do you suggest to the woman whose husband is not talking about it? What did they do?
Yeah, well, first things first, if they have a relationship with the Lord, they're going to need to take it to him. Yeah. Because they, in and of themselves, are not equipped to get someone who doesn't want to open up. Yeah. And they'll try different things, ultimatums, threatening divorce, and all these other things, or getting violent themselves, although that's rare. But I would say that I really wish I had a silver bullet here, but there isn't one. First and foremost, you got to spend time with the Lord, because he may say, I need you to just weather the storm. I need you to just, I'm working on him, or I'm not working on him. And these are I'm just talking about relatively normally functioning relationships, not like crazy shit. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, the problem is that men are taught to suck it up and to be a man. You'll get contradictory messages from women. One will say, you're not opening up enough. You're not being sensitive or aware of your feelings enough. And then other times they'll be like, be a man, grow a pair of balls. Yeah. So it's like two messages that a guy's receiving. Yeah. And men giving messages to men tend to be, this is not a hard and fast rule, that if you're afraid or insecure or weak or whatever, bluff your way through it. John Wayne your way through it, which is just a tragedy. So all that to say is that if a woman is looking and keeping this in mind when she's looking at her husband, boyfriend, whatever, and he's not opening up, I don't know. I've heard of marriages being fixed by threats, like a woman threatening a man. Yeah. I've heard of marriages being rescued by a woman just being long-suffering. Yeah. And I mean long-suffering with some of that. Yeah. And then I've heard where a woman will actually start saying, hey, what's going on with you and this and that. And if the guy has any health to him, he may start opening up. I would definitely say that no matter what he says, no matter how batshit crazy it sounds at first blush, keep a poker face. Like, don't react, don't scowl, don't show any disgust. Like, just literally just try to be a mannequin while I guarantee you, he's going to be reading your body language carefully.
Yeah.
Don't hiss or be like, tut or anything like that.
Yeah.
If he starts talking, just listen. Maybe ask some follow-up questions. Don't ask questions, though, that look like you're gunning at him. You know what I mean? Like if he's like, I guess I'll just use myself an example. If like I come home and I'm like, I think I was followed. You could be like, look at me like I'm crazy and be like, you think you were followed? Why? Or something like that, right? Which just makes me feel like an idiot. And like I wasn't really being followed, even though I'm perfectly clear that I was being followed. But, so questions that aren't like, don't have that passive aggressive undertone about them. I mean, it's a lot, man. Yeah. Essentially, depending on how destroyed the relationship already is, to get a wife or a girlfriend to do any of this is asking a lot already. Yeah. Because usually by the time they're asking, how do I get this guy to open up? This dude has shit the bed a ton. So the compassion's worn out, the sympathy's worn out, the understanding's all dried up. So that's why I would say first things first, spend time with God. Yeah. I know it sounds like a bullshit answer, go to the Bible, blah, 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 blah. But just think about it, man. I mean, if the Lord made men, he knows how to fix them. Yeah. So you might as well go to the one who knows how to fix that individual.
Yeah, agreed. No, that's really good. I think I would add to that just based on our experience over the last 2 years of like, you've been receptive and open to counseling, and that's been a big thing for you. But also in addition to that, like I've needed counseling by myself as well. And so I would absolutely encourage the women listening, especially if they don't have a husband who is communicating about it. Like that woman needs to have a counselor, a therapist in their life to help them to understand it, be aware of it, like to be able to have somebody to dissect it with and analyze it with if their husband isn't willing to do that.
Yeah, there's no room for superhero women here. They're definitely going to need support. Men desperately need support, but they're too prideful to get it and too arrogant. And worse yet, now these guys are buying into stoicism. Just spend time reading about it in the Greeks. It's not good. Yeah. And then they're dipping into fatalism. So basically they're doing two things. They're saying feelings are nothing but poisonous. They're unreliable. They bring nothing but misery. I'm not going to feel anything. And then they combine it with, fuck it, I don't care what happens. Right. I mean, come on, man. That shit's not going to keep the boat sailing for long. So I'm saying men need support too, but this, by the way, just on a side note, if you know about your dude, if he has a high threshold for pain, that's probably not going to bode well for you guys because that means he can take a lot of shit before he's willing to start asking questions. Some even write it all the way into the grave. Yeah. But yes, women need support. They need encouragement. They need to know it's not their responsibility to save a man. They weren't designed that way. And in fact, it's, I believe, morally irresponsible to think that they're supposed to rescue their dude, and that it's okay that there's that confusion and bewilderment. I mean, if you're talking to a dude who's temperamental and you're getting the sensation you're walking on eggshells, you're going to feel freaked out. Yep. You're going to be like, oh my God, what is going on? Women can see the shift. Yeah. And so, you're going to be freaked out, pissed. It's unfair. The whole system's unfair though. So you can talk about how it's unfair, but that won't save you at the end of the day. You're going to need to, unfortunately, the Lord would probably ask you to say, surrender that to me, which is not always a joyful ride. So women getting support for sure, counseling. I recommend journaling, diarying, writing their thoughts out. Because at least for me, journaling has a way of if you're just saying it in your head, it's like you writing it down and rereading it is like being peer reviewed.
Yep.
But the bottom line is that you're more than likely going to feel all kinds of things. Some of it justified, some of it probably less so. But there's no way you're going to be able to be a superhero and self-rescue, much less rescue your husband or boyfriend. And it's just not how it was meant to be.
Yeah.
The only one who can save is God. He can use secondary means like people, places, and things. But no matter how you cut the pie up, it all ends up back at his doorstep.
Yeah.
So just realize it's unpleasant. It's not fair.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I do want to just call out, I think it's important because of where we're at in our culture right now, like, want to make sure that the Courage Becomes Her women aren't hearing us say we're condoning abuse or neglect or, anything like that. And that each and every one of us have to decide for ourselves, like where we draw the line.
Absolutely. 100% for sure. Each person has to talk to God. And I mean, apart from the common sense he gave us,
Sure.
God gave you common sense, pay attention to your gut and only they'll know if the guy's just talking shit and burning off steam or if he's like legit on the verge of violence.
Yeah.
She has to know that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, definitely don't, I wouldn't laugh it off if you're in the middle of that. I would pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. Okay. So we pretty much have covered a lot of this, but I want to kind of summarize it. Like, wives can, again, it's not our responsibility. It's not our fault. We're not going to personalize it as it's about us. But I also do think that based on what you've said, it's important to identify that there are ways that wives can do greater damage. So some that you've already mentioned. Before
I get to that, I would say that this is like, if you try to actually pin it down and really define it, and you say to a woman whose guy's just banging everything that moves, don't take it personally. There's a truth to that theologically, but there's also, they should be taking it personally because the guy is betraying them as them. He's betraying them.
Right.
So there is a personal element to it. I think where it might get, and again, it's really hard to pin down, is if a woman whose guy's banging around, if she says to herself, oh, I have no value, or my value is reduced because my dude can't stop, that's a mistake. And in fact, I would even say that if I can, although I don't really have a right to speak adamantly about what a woman should or shouldn't be doing, because I don't walk in those shoes, I would encourage them to perhaps recognize the theological truth that if they are taking it on as a wounding to their value, their inherent value in the Lord, that's a mistake, even risky and dangerous, perhaps. But the problem is that God is invisible. So you're talking to the Lord, and the Lord, you're reading scripture, and the Holy Spirit's on you, and and you're like, oh, you love me, Jesus, and that's all that matters. And then you see a guy, and you're like, shit. You know what I mean? It's like, it's hard to negate the flesh and blood.
Yep.
And I don't know what the recipe is that makes that balance itself out. Like, how much scripture, it just seems like we're always going to have a little bit of a weakness toward flesh and blood. I mean, that just is what it is.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you for, helping us to be mindful of those for sure. Okay. So just to recap though, the few things that you did call out that I want to make sure we pay attention to, I really liked how you said, like, don't react, don't scowl, don't pull the whole masculinity card of like telling them to be a man, but also at the same time wanting them to be a sensitive person.
I would want to add on that too, is that I think sometimes women are caught off guard when they say to their guy, I want you to be open and honest and tell me how you truly feel. women should prepare themselves for a fucking dam to break. Like, because they might be thinking, oh, he's just going to say, oh, I'm scared because my job looks like it's in jeopardy and I'm feeling anxious. And it's all going to be this real clean, neat expression. Really, it's probably going to be a shitstorm of emotion, which will probably get his engine running, which means that it's going to pick up speed and tempo, which is going to be freaky.
Yeah.
So that if they do get a guy to open up and it looks like the dam's breaking, just in their mind, be prepared that is a possibility and not to be like, oh, what is happening right now?
Yeah. Wow. That makes a lot of sense. That's really good. And emphasizes even more of having a counselor or therapist in your life so that you're not just running to your BFF or your mom or somebody else to go and vent, that you're going to someone who can actually help you walk through that.
You definitely want an objective party on the scene.
That's good. Yeah, really good. Friends, thank you so much for listening to today's conversation with Corey. I know that it's heavy, and these have been some heavy conversations, and I'm just so grateful for you to be listening in. I know that there are so many marriages that are struggling right now, and that, as I said in the beginning, insecurity and fear and anger is a real present issue. So will you think of the woman in your life who could really use the hope and the encouragement that this conversation brings and could bring to her and her marriage and the struggles that she might be facing, and send it along to her today? That would make such a difference for that woman in your life. I know it to be true. And don't forget to please rate and review the Courage Becomes Her podcast through whatever player that you're using. Just click that 5-star button and write a review about what is meaningful to you or helpful to you about this podcast. I would be so grateful. Let's get back to the conversation with Corey. Okay, so we said we would come back to how it is that wives can be supportive. So we've talked about a variety of that throughout the conversation. I think one of the things that you said that I think is really important to call out is that it's not fair. And I think that we need to say that to ourselves, allow ourselves to say it out loud of, okay, this isn't fair, but I chose to marry this person for a reason, and I want to, as best I can, be kind, be compassionate, be respectful and caring while my husband is on, this journey as well. So kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the latter part is if a woman is saying that latter part to herself, she might be pressing herself too hard. I think it would be better to slow way down and just really kind of sit with the injustice, the unfairness, the brokenness. Because if you try to rush past those feelings in an effort to have a happy-go-lucky marriage, it's going to come back out. And because essentially what will happen is if you don't give yourself a chance to really feel it, it'll turn into resentment. So like when you're like trying to be all kind and everything, but in the back of your mind and deep down in your heart, you'll be like, this is bullshit. This is not fair. You're going to start building up resentment and anger and probably, I don't know how it rolls down for women, but I imagine at some point it'll turn into disillusionment. And then, and that's not a place you want to be.
Yeah.
So.
I love that. That's good Enneagram 4 wisdom right there, for sure.
You're welcome.
That's good. So any other specific things that you can say that, and maybe we make it a little bit more personal so that we can, kind of add that personal experience component to it. Like, are there things that I have done that have been helpful to you and supportive of you as you've been going through this?
Yeah, definitely you checking in with me, whether through text or face to face, where you're at emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Like, I would just say one thing, like, if people are going to practice communicating better, sometimes if it's possible, it doesn't always have to be in play, but if you're approaching the fella and you're in a heavy place, this might not be possible. But generally, if you can say something positive in the conversation. So, like, for example, you might say to the guy, I'm really discouraged about finances or my kids or the frickin' teacher at school. And it's really getting under my skin and pissing me off, and you kind of rant a little bit. But if you can kind of bring it back around for yourself, but also for the guy, like, yet nevertheless, here's the silver lining, or here's some hope. Because what that will, the weird side effect of that is that a guy won't be seeing you as a constant source of instability and just one more thing he has to try to fix and to make everything work in his life. So, bringing if it's possible, and if you, feel like you're being genuine about it, don't fake it, because that comes out real quick.
Yeah.
Try to be a little bit positive.
Yeah. No, that's good. I appreciate that very much.
So, yeah, you checking in with me, where you're at emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, that really alleviates a lot of my stress, because what happens for someone like me, and the problem is porn is mostly made by men, and it has a particular narrative to it. And that narrative, it seems absurd at first, but the more you look at it, the more you start to believe it. And so for someone like me, that backfires. Well, it backfires, period. But it especially backfires when you're not communicating, because my mind then thinks, oh, she's eye banging someone else or wants someone else. So when you communicate with me, it destroys that fear, that anxiety. So when you say to me, Corey, I know you struggle with not having a father. Why don't you look up scriptures where God says he's a father to you? That kind of stuff really helps me out. Plus, it shows that you care. Like, it's weird. It's like, I'd rather you be like, oh my God, you're smoking hot. But instead, you're like, are you reading scripture? Are you talking to the Lord? It's like it shows me like you actually care about me as me. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're rooting for Corey. Like, you want Corey to be spiritually in tune with the Lord. It's weird. It's like, it's a kind of affirmation and validation. It's just not the hot kind. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's one of those ones that, like, man, it seems like it takes forever to bear fruit in the guy's mind, but it does bear fruit eventually. Eventually he's going to start realizing, wait a minute. She's asking me how I'm doing spiritually. She's concerned about the condition of my soul, mind, heart, will. That tells me that she's in this for me. It just depends on how out in left field he is. It may take a long time for him to connect those dots. But that's one thing for me that's been of use. It's weird too, because like women will, do things like that and say things like that. But depending on how, unhealthy the guy is, he may just straight up call bullshit and say, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
And you could be like totally sincere and he's just not going to believe you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I would encourage the women listening to go back and listen to episode 35 from May 9th with Jill Savage. She is my personal counselor, marriage coach. And in that conversation, she talks about how she did that with her husband, Mark, when he wasn't receptive. And so just listening to her talk about like, she said that she was doing that for herself and her growth and wanting to make those inroads and be supportive with her husband, but she was going to do it regardless of if there was, positive reception from her husband. So I think that conversation is really helpful for what you're talking about right now. I also, in that conversation, she does give a couple of other specific, like tangible, practical things that wives can do to be supportive. And we won't go into them now together, but things like ghosting other people when you just need to keep your world small and, focus on your marriage and, let other things outside of life go and not venting publicly and those sorts of things. So she's got some really good insights for that. So is there anything else, Corey, that we haven't talked about that you would share with the Women of Courage Becomes Her concerning this conversation?
There's no recipe. There's no words to chant. There's no silver bullet. There's no clean and easy way through a messy relationship, whether it's, friend to friend, employee to boss, or parent to child, or spouses. It just seems that there's an inherent amount of dysfunction built into the system of life that for whatever reason, God seems okay with allowing it to be in play. I assume it's because generally speaking, most people need a certain amount of pain to wake up to their own shortcomings. I mean, if you pay attention to success stories in life, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, when somebody has success, it's not like they become more humble and more grateful. I mean, Paul was taken up into the third heaven. Anyway, he came back down, something, no one gets to see for the most part on earth. And he became prideful, and he became so damn prideful that God had to afflict his body. So my point is that pain has a way of waking us up spiritually to God, and that at some point learning to say, I'm not in control here. I'm not a superhero. I'm not going to be able to self-rescue my way out of this. And I'm sure shit not going to be able to rescue that dude out of this. And just being okay with that.
That's good. Yeah, thank you. So for Courage Becomes Her, we have a closing question that all of our guests answer of who or what is inspiring courage in you right now.
Like right now?
Well, I mean, in general.
Oh, in general?
Today, this week.
Man, I got to say Tim Keller's rocking it pretty good.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So,
yeah,
he just has a way. He has a way of really getting at the underlying, thought behind the thought behind the thought.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And I will link in the show notes several books and other resources that have been tremendously helpful to Corey and I over the last 2 years, inclusive of a couple of Tim Keller's books. So.
Oh, you might want to tell them either for themselves, and if by some miracle they can get it into the guy's hand, that emotion book that deals with the cognitive theory of emotion.
Yeah.
Because that's super, that would help a guy really well if he's willing to listen, of how to actually understand the nature of emotion, its role, and its ultimate influence, which is the thought life. Because historically, and I mean, going all the way back to the Greeks, emotion is considered the passions or the appetites, and it's considered unstable, like a unruly child. But that is, although that's how it has played out, that's technically false. It really is based on an idea. So if a guy who's yelling at you because he's having a bout of insecurity, if you were able to somehow get him outside of himself and back him up and look at what he actually told himself in the moment of insecurity, emotionally, he's just reacting to that thought. And a lot of times, and I don't know why feelings are this way. Feelings are truthful, but they don't determine truth. So if you feel something, it's a real feeling that's reacting truly to something, but it can't tell you if what you're reacting to is actually in itself true or false.
Yeah.
So that requires a little bit of willingness to kind of sit and wrestle out with the idea. So I would recommend them the emotion book if they can read that for themselves and possibly get it into the guy's hand. That would probably help a lot of confusion.
Yeah, agreed, for sure. Well, I know I said it in the beginning, babe, but thanks for your courage and willingness to be vulnerable and join me for this conversation today. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I just want to close by saying that, again, I know Corey said it a couple of times, but if this is something that you're going through, it isn't fair, and we are sorry. We know from personal experience, I know from personal experience of these last 2 years that it's hard, and it's a really, really difficult thing to work through. And there have been times where, Corey and I have truly felt like we were not going to make it, and that, despair was overtaking us. And if you, again, can, and if you feel like this is what you are being led to, just hang in there and hang on and, do whatever it is that's in front of you to do the work, to be loving and caring toward yourself as well as toward your husband. And I really hope that through this conversation that you feel encouraged, and that we've given a little bit of hope, especially for those of you who are maybe going through this and are in the messy middle of this. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. What an honor to help you to cultivate confidence, courage, and joy in your life and work. Thank you so much for inviting me to journey with you. I look forward to being back with you next week, where we'll hear another story from a woman whom I love and am inspired by and look forward to learning from.